decades ago, it was not in the news as it is now. Now it is like really a buzz with DEI becoming a dirty word, if I may say so, and with dismantling happening of DEI offices in some parts of the world and some restructuring happening. We have, for us as a developing countries, there are other contextual factors that bring about inequity. And so our purpose was to sort of look at those and bring in experts from all over the world and parts from all over the world to try to understand and share our, celebrate our actually differences with each other. Frankly speaking, if I may say, no amount of planning could have equaled the largest of the 10 international experts that agreed, people like you, Zoe and Paul, that agreed to join us. You are the moving force behind this series, and we really prize the knowledge that you bring to our part of the world. I must also say a thanks to our National Academy of Higher Education for international participants. The Academy is the central level, national level for professional development of university teachers. And it is housed in the Higher Education Commission. And many of you probably have University Grants Commission or some other names for your countries, but that's the sort of commission that offers guidelines and suggestive recommendations to bring higher education together. So we have to thank them too for their support. But first of all, who are we? The Center of Learning and Teaching at the Forman Christian College was developed, I think, some 15 years ago, and we were perhaps the only ones in Pakistan at a campus at that time, and there was only one person at that time. And then slowly today, I'm very proud to have that we have Mavish, the deputy head. Mavish Raza, can you do a wave wherever you are? I think she's driving to school.
Hi.
Hi.
I just came back home, yeah.
Yeah, she had gone to pick up her daughter from school. That's what lives are all about, right? And we have a remarkable manager, Gohar. Yes, he's the one who does all the logistics, and he puts us together, coordinates the office functioning. And then, of course, a very new join at CLT, Fatma Ismail, who is the educational developer who has worked very, very closely with me on this series. I would also talk a little bit about the session yesterday. The session yesterday was a foundational session for us in a way. Penny Jane from Australia, she's also a UNESCO chair in equity, educational equity, was a remarkable academic who sort of gave a whole exposure about what it is that educational inequity is. And she talked about lots of dimensions that embrace this term and how difficult it is, because everything that she talked about, how everything that you do might actually consolidate the diversity and the inequity that you're trying to remove. So she talked about those challenges. And Helen from Lingnan University, Hong Kong, was very, very hands-on and very, very helpful for in helping us understand how the practical application of inequity. And she gave practical examples of holistic student development and equity and so on. And hers was a very, so she really, the two speakers put us in a very good, a starting mode. And if many of participants today have attended yesterday also, are pretty ready now, hopefully, to take it to the next level that you, Zoe, and Paul will take. I'm very going to, we had 495 participants yesterday who stayed glued with us still for all the 2 hours. So very thankful for that as well. Just to say that as we move on, what was our framework? I just want to briefly touch upon the framework that we used to develop these series. And as you see, this is a Loden et al., developed wheel diversity wheel, and you can see there are 5 levels. And I thought that was a very, in a way, a simplistic and yet an understandable model of what diversity entails. It entails you as a person and all the different facets that you have, which means gender, ethnicity, age, religion. Then there is the internal factors. And those internal factors, I'm sorry, I talked about them. The personality is you, is who you are, what you think about yourself, your own concept, and the persona that the other world sees. So that is you, which is diversity. And then there are internal factors that define you. And then there are external factors, which are your experiences, your status, what you're born into, your background, education, citizenship, geographic location, which is becoming very true for some of us right now, how important the geographic location is. Some of us are persona non grata in some parts of the world. So there is that diversity happening. There are institutional factors, and then there are era factors, the era that we are living in, the times we are living in, and they define. But this is not as simplistic. We all know that there are multiple nuances and intensities within each of these 23 components that you see in the 5 levels. And they will keep producing unique personalities and unique situations and unique human beings. And how to sort of do away with that diversity, bring together that diversity and do away with the inequity that might arise is a challenging task for any person, and especially at higher education, when you come with all of these things already established or conditioned within yourself. And how do you change them? How do you bring about changes which are sustainable and meaningful? So Zoe and Paul, I'm going to sort of lay the ground over to you. You are our oh, sorry, I forgot. There, Gohar, thank you for putting up the netiquettes for me. That's what you're for. When I start talking, over to you, Fatma. Please, if
Okay,
you.
hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. Before we begin, I'm going to run you through the etiquette for the session. Please rename your Zoom name so that it includes your university name followed by your full name, because we would need that for verification when we will check your name for attendance. Please make sure that you rename your Zoom account. You will be muted during the session. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. Please note that 75% of participation is mandatory for certification. Lastly, the session is being recorded and the recording will be available on our CLT YouTube channel. And I see many of you typing your name into the chat. Please note that we will have the record for attendance and you don't need to type your names into the chat for attendance. Okay, thank you so much once again for joining us. Over to you, Dr. Ruxana.
Thank you, Fatima. Just to say, please leave your questions in the chat and we will address them after the two experts have presented their talks. I'm going to go straight over to Zoe and Paul Ashwin. Paul and Zoe comes from Demont University, UK. She is the Associate Dean, while Paul is a Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Research, Lancaster University. The themes that we will cover in today's sessions are, which Zoe will cover, is holistic student development and how institutional structures and pedagogies affect the student development. And we are very proud to say that we have not considered only academic success as a end result for an impactful, sustainable. I think that's what is the whole person success that's required. And according to the 21st century skills and according to the context, more importantly, where you live in, the life skills that you carry with you are as important as the career or the job market or any other skills that you will need as you go in life. And that's what makes you successful. It's the whole person. You cannot say that it's only the academic success that will make you successful. I'm just trying to lay it out very simply. So, Zoe, I invite you as the first expert Just a bit brief about you, your bio. You are passionate about enhancing opportunities for students and staff with a focus on developing approaches on embedding mental well-being. And that's, I think, the key to a holistic student development is within the well-being framework. You're a principal fellow of Higher Education Academy. You're a national teaching fellow. You have a collaborative award for teaching excellence in 2022. What an honor to have you with us, Zoe. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning for me, this afternoon, and for whatever time zone it is, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. Let me now just share my screen so that you can all see what I am talking to. And hopefully that is now on your screens. So the topic I've been set for today and asked to talk particularly around is around institutional policy, governance and the pedagogies for holistic student development. And I really hope that this sets the scene for what Paul will then go on to talk about in his part of the session as well. So a real pleasure to be with you all, and I hope this sets the scene usefully. So what I'm going to think about first of all is breaking down some of those key topics within the concept of institutional policy, governance and pedagogies for holistic student development. I want to start by thinking about holistic student development, the reasons for it, why might we do it, and why might we approach things in a holistic way? To recognise, now that might seem unusual, but want to think about, well, who is involved in these sorts of activities? Who is enabling it, or perhaps even trying to prevent it? Key things to think about. I want to think about some resources as well. There are lots of resources available. We'll touch on a few today, but essentially what I'm trying to say is we don't always need to start from the beginning. There are often some really good things out there that we can use as well. And also, let's have a look at some methods. Let's explore some of the ways in which we might think about doing holistic student development. We're going to as well explore the role of institutional policy and governance in equity within and related to student experience and development. And we'll consider some of the pedagogies that might be involved in holistic student development, why and where we might seek to integrate student development holistically. But first, and just following on very briefly from that lovely introduction, a little bit about me so that you know who I am and where I'm coming from. And I share this because I think it's really important that whenever we come to a big topic such as student development, we remember ourselves and our own positionality within that. So as was kindly mentioned, I'm a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a National Teaching Fellow and an award leader for a Collaborative Award for Teaching Excellence. And these are all schemes within the United Kingdom's higher education system that recognise the levels of teaching excellence. In terms of contributions to the sector, I am a member of the Office of the Independent Adjudicators Higher Education Advisory Panel. Essentially, the Office of the Independent Adjudicator is our ombudsman. They're the people who check up on, are we doing what we said we would do in terms of making sure our students have a fair opportunity to engage with things and that they can raise complaints and concerns if, for example, something can't be dealt with at the university level. And in that role, I support sector activity looking at emerging concerns and complaints. So it's really useful having a sense of what's coming out across the sector. I've also been a member of the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales's Student Opportunity and Advisory Committee. And I was invited to be part of that with my sort of recognition of the work I've done around embedding mental well-being in the curriculum. That's a particular focus of mine, but also some work I've been doing around employability and recognising that the holistic journey that students need to go on to develop those important skills. I'm also a member of the committee of the Association of National Teacher Fellows and their communications officer. So again, having that chance to recognise good practice that happens in the sector and share it more broadly is a really exciting part of that role. And I've also led, and bits that I'll pick up on today throughout my presentation, a quality assurance agency collaborative enhancement project around embedding mental well-being, where we looked at the methods and the benefits. And that brought together 7 providers and a students' union to look at understanding why we might want to embed mental well-being in the curriculum. So there'll be some key points I can draw out from that in our discussions today. In terms of where I'm based, so I am an Associate Dean Academic at De Montfort University. Now, De Montfort, if you recognise that little bit of the map that you can see on your screen, is almost in the middle of England. We're almost as far away from the sea as you can possibly be in England. That's how to locate us. We have around 35,000 students worldwide, and our main base is in Leicester in the UK. But we will soon be launching a London campus, and we've also got campuses in Dubai, Kazakhstan and Cambodia. In terms of my daily role, I am responsible for the academic leadership of 9,000 students and 300 staff across all of those campuses, and also in relation to 7 UK partnerships and 5 other international partners. And that's responsible for all of the activity that happens for students in terms of their educational experience and development, and ensuring the quality of that experience for all of that taught provision. And a bit of a caveat as to why I'm interested in mental health and well-being, particularly alongside all of the other things I do. It's worth noting that 16% of the students who come to us at DMU Leicester declare a disability. We actually think there's probably quite a few more who choose not to declare, and that is absolutely fine. We support all students as best we can. We do a lot of work around widening participation, so encouraging students to come to university who may not previously have thought that this was an option for them, or similarly who might be what we term first in family, so the first person in their family to come to university. We have a number of students who would have had free school meals because of the levels of potential disadvantage that they've come from. So that just gives a little bit of a sense of the sort of university we are. We do a lot of good for a lot of people as best we can. And aligned with that, one of my key roles recently has been to lead on what we call an access and participation plan. Now, this is a requirement, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, that actually is required of us by the Office for Students. And they ask us to think about the risks to equality of opportunity for all learners. And that extends from people who may not even have thought about coming to university yet. We have a duty to make sure that our universities actually promote the concept of coming to university across the region, right through to making sure that everybody who starts with us actually has the best opportunities to succeed and thrive, regardless of any of their sort of differences and things like that that could potentially be an equitable risk to their educational experience. I'm also very keen, as I've mentioned, on embedding mental wellbeing in the curriculum. I've led work within the university on this, and I'm also involved in lots of equity activity across the university. I'm chair of our faculty's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and I represent the faculty on various bodies that look at gender equality and ethnicity equality, all sorts of different things. So I hope that gives a little bit of positionality about me. As I talk today, and perhaps present some overarching themes, some ideas, and I may ask you some questions, do think about it from your perspective. Okay, we're not all experts in everything, and I think that's important to note. It's really important to think about it from your individual perspective. So do that as we go through today's content. Let's think then about holistic student development and the reasons why we might do that. And I'm going to frame this around some questions. It's important to ask ourselves why. Why might we want to do holistic student development? Why might we not just say, oh, that team over there can do it, and that'll be that box ticked? Actually, we're often thinking about why do we want to do student development in a holistic way? Because we're responding to need. We might be responding to the students who are sitting in front of us in a classroom. We might be responding to some data that we're looking at, to external requirements, or anecdotal things, and indeed things that we can anticipate are coming. Often as well, it's the right thing to do. We know that we don't want to be causing a negative student experience and student development opportunities. So we're looking and we're thinking about how can we enhance the experience for everybody in a way that gives them the chance to develop a range of skills. And we need to recognise that actually lots of different people are involved in that. There'll be lots of different teams who can come in at different points in time to provide their expertise. So actually working together, working holistically is a really positive way forward for thinking about student development. And I encourage you to think perhaps of this a bit like a research question. If research is more your thing than teaching, sometimes it can help to flip this the other way around. If you think about what it is you're trying to address, then actually sometimes that helps you get to what it is you need to ask the questions about, and that helps your planning as well. So you can think about this within your own context. What does student development look like in the role that I do? Who do I work with to make sure that we're giving students the chance to develop in whatever skills that might be, not just their academic skills, but the whole range of things that go around that, and then support them going out into whatever they might do next. And what can I learn from others to help develop that further? How can I work with others as well? And that begins to build that lovely holistic view of student development. We also want to think about recognising the people that are involved in holistic student development. So we ask ourselves, who is currently involved in student development activity? And that can sometimes be easy to signpost a team that may have that with that name in their title of their team. Or actually, we can think of it as being everybody. We're all here to help develop students in whatever way that we can, in whatever our unique approach might be. And who can support the integration of holistic activity? And that's where we start to think about the concepts of policy and governance, which I'll come on to shortly. I think it's really important that we look at who is currently involved in this sort of work and this sort of activity. We might see student development in the curriculum, in student support activity, as I say, in terms of our equity policies, our governance, all sorts of things like that. It's important to note who our experts and our supporters are. Who are the people that are really going to champion this type of approach? That's important because it finds the people who want to make the difference, and they're often really good people to have in discussions. And it can sometimes avoid that top-down approach. If you've ever been in those kind of situations where something is given to you to have to do, that can feel a little bit demoralizing. But actually, if it's being sort of coming from this groundswell of people that are really enthusiastic, that can be something that perhaps a little bit easier to get on board with. It's also important to recognise those barriers and those concerns as well. So who is not in that conversation? What barriers might there be to bringing people together to discuss equality and equity in terms of student development? And think about what concerns might also exist. And then we also might want to identify who those strategic leaders are, who is involved in that leadership level around setting the policies and the governance around these kind of topics. So think here about your contextual need. So we talked about that already. Who are the leaders and the managers who might be involved in these kind of settings? And let's make sure that actually thinking about student development holistically is part of what they do every day, so that it becomes a really normalised process. And what I'm going to say here is it's important that the people involved in this recognise that they don't need to be experts. It can be any one of us who is involved in holistic student development. We don't need to be an expert about every single part of the process. But what we do need is to have the right information, the right tools, the right support, the right input to try and make a difference by sharing the right messages and the right information at the appropriate times. We might also think about the resources that we could use in holistic student development and think about what resources are already available to us. Now, I encourage this because there are a lot of resources already out there in the sector to think about these sorts of concepts. It's important to think about actually what has already happened in the sector, what information is already out there that we can use. And then those kind of examples can be used as tools to think about planning within our own context, and also to think about prompts, to think, oh yes, we hadn't thought of that. We need to go down that avenue. We need to ask those kind of questions. So lots of different things to look at, and we'll have a look at a few resources in a few moments. In terms of some particular resources that I like to highlight with my background in mental health and wellbeing, I've pulled out 3 here, 3 that I know particularly well, 2 that I use on a sort of regular basis for reference, and 1 that I was actually involved in leading. So the 3 on your screen, and I'm sure these slides will be shared with you so that you'll have all of these links, are 3 that I particularly recommend. The first one on your screen is Advanced HE's Education for Mental Health Toolkit. Lots of really good examples in there. Secondly, Students' Minds University Mental Health Charter. Within the UK, many of us sign up to doing an award called the University Mental Health Charter Award, recognising how much effort we're putting into thinking about mental health for our students and our staff as well. And the final one is the piece of work I led on around the Quality Assurance Agency Collaborative Enhancement Project around embedding mental wellbeing in the curriculum. And I share these as examples, and again, encourage you to think about examples that you like using. You may prefer ones that have got lots of images in or lots of models. Find the things that work for you. These sorts of examples give a good sense of what's happening in the sector, what's already been done. And often they include extensive literature review and consultation and input from the sector. And that can be really useful when we're thinking about student development, because actually a lot of that legwork is done for us. We don't need to start again. Use what's out there and is already available, and then adapt it as you see fit to your own circumstances. I would encourage you to think about who is interested in these kind of things in your provider, in your university, and what sort of skills and strengths do you already have in your university? I'm sure many of you will recognise that there are things that you do really well to support student development. But are there any areas that perhaps could do better? And those things are equally important to recognise. Those strengths are things you can build upon. The other things are things that you can think, okay, there's perhaps more for us to do. What can we learn from the sector, from resources that are already available? But also, what can we learn from the good things we already do within our university? Because those things can often be adapted and rethought about by just bringing people together who are happy to have that conversation and explore those concepts. Let's move on a little bit and think about institutional policy and governance. And let's start with some terminology, because I appreciate these aren't necessarily things you're thinking about every day if you're in the classroom. So universities are often governed, and again, it may be different in your setting. You may have different terms. I'm going to use sort of very UK versions of these terms, so forgive me for that. But do think about this in your context. Universities are often governed by a body of external individuals, people who make up what is called a governing body, a board of governors. There are slightly different names. So again, do think about that in your context. Think about those governing bodies. If you can, find out who's on your governing body. It can be quite interesting just to know who it is. It may be local experts, it may be other people who seemingly have nothing to do with higher education, but they bring a really interesting skill set to the task. Because governing bodies are invited to consider information that's presented to them, often rather large meetings, or that they might request, they might want to see some information. And they're doing that to ensure that they are making sure that your university is doing what it should be doing, that it's offering a good university experience for everybody involved. And in the context of today's talks, that it's really making sure that equity is part and parcel of those considerations and those discussions. And the effectiveness of a governing body should be based on really strong foundations. So clearly set out in advance what it is that governing body is expected to do and the roles and behaviours. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. So when presenting information to governors, that needs to be really high quality information using sound processes that are consistent across the suite of activity they might be thinking about so that they can make informed decisions. Now, why is this important in holistic student development? This is important because these are often your decision makers, the people who are deciding how much of an effort and an interest your university is going to have on something like holistic student development. So really important to know who those people are. And if you're somebody who's in a position to influence the way that holistic student development is approached, then actually knowing how to present that to your governing body is really important. You may be thinking, but I'm a teacher, I just do my teaching and that's my role. That's fine, but actually, collectively, we're all teachers. I certainly was and still continue to do bits here and there, but you know, we all have a role to play. And when we come together, we can actually influence what happens in those governing body discussions. And policy, let's touch on that as well. Policies are essentially guidelines that determine what happens, the decisions and the procedures within an organisation such as a university. And again, I encourage you to think about your university. I bet there are lots and lots of different policies. These might relate to academic matters, how you actually do things, and making sure that they all are done consistently and fairly to ensure equity. There may be some policies that relate to the employment of you as a member of staff and your colleagues, and also things around how assessment is managed, and all sorts of other things. So do find out about the policies that exist, particularly around the curriculum in terms of the topics we're thinking about today. It's important to be aware of the policies in your provider. The chances are they will vary slightly between universities, but probably have similar concepts at their very heart. So let's have a think about the role of governance. Good governance will facilitate and enable organisational stability, and essentially it will also support growth and development. So if you're thinking, we're in a place where we've got some good examples of student development activity, but really we want to make this a much bigger thing, we want a much greater focus on it, you're going to need to try and engage your governing body in thinking about this too. Now, as we've mentioned, your governors are often skilled individuals, often from outside the higher education sector. But when they were invited to consider being on your governing body, and indeed when they did actually then accept that opportunity, they will have agreed to various series of values and things that they can sign up to explain that, yes, this is my role as a governor. And in the UK, we have a committee of university chairs, and they outline some of these values. There's values around integrity. So your governing body will seek and reassure that academic governance is robust and it's effective in providing and ensuring those academic standards. There's activity around sustainability. So obviously making sure that your university remains financially sustainable. Now, that's a challenge across the sector at the minute, particularly for UK higher education. So your governors are likely to be having lots of discussions about the resources, the people, the activity. And so if I were presenting a new plan around holistic student development, I would be thinking about how can I articulate this in a way that demonstrates it is sustainable, that actually by bringing people together, we present a sustainable approach to holistic student development. Inclusivity as well, really nice to see this included in these values, that actually the governing body itself should be promoting a positive culture that supports inclusivity and equity across the institution. Excellence, of course, we want to recognise that all of our universities provide high quality experience. Innovation and growth, really key for our universities, ensuring that we are future facing, that our activity is future facing, and that our students and our graduates are going to be ready to embrace those things that we may not even have predicted yet, but we're giving them that chance to develop holistically. And community as well, recognising a university's place within, not just all of the people within a university community, but within the larger community, the location, your region, that kind of thing. Really important things for our governors to be thinking about when they're making their decisions. And again, the UK Committee of University Chairs go on to identify 6 elements of governance, and I'm just going to touch on some of these. Our governors should be accountable, so they have to be accountable for their decisions and their actions, and so making sure that they consider things fairly. They're often the final decision-making body for a university, so again, if your university is on a journey thinking about holistic student development and wanting to do more in this space, ultimately, remember, it will be your governing body that are the people you need to convince that this is the thing to do. So be thinking about that as you're developing your plans. Sustainability appears again, and we've talked about that. Reputation as well, really key. The governing body is important in thinking about the reputation of your university within its university and outside, and safeguarding and promoting that activity. And key here, equality, inclusivity and diversity. So clearly aligned with the themes of this webinar series. And governing bodies should recognise that the makeup of the people that they represent within their university, and should seek to understand and address the equality, inclusivity and diversity issues that arise, where there's any gaps, for example, where there are positive gaps, look to work with those and to understand why that's come about, but to try and make sure that any underrepresentation, any inequality is addressed and that there are targeted measures to do this. And again, effectiveness comes up and engagement in terms of those roles. Another thing that's particularly relevant in the UK, but I share it here because I think it's relevant to think about if you're thinking about actually who are the decision makers within the university and what might be the framework in which they're working. We have it in the UK a system called the Nolan Principles. So these are for any sort of governing organisation that sits that aligns with any sort of organisation, not just a university. And they have various different sort of key headline topics here. They are thinking about being selfless so that they are always acting in the public interest. They must demonstrate integrity. So they're thinking about avoiding inappropriate influence and declaring and resolving any of those interests or relationships that might exist. They need to be objective in terms of taking actions and decisions fairly and making sure that they do that based on evidence and without any sort of discrimination or bias. They're asked to be accountable, so accountable to the public for their decisions. Often they're involved in controlling quite large sums of financial money. So that's really important. And being open with the people that they represent, but also open outwardly as well about the decisions they've taken. Being honest, so being truthful about what it is they're considering and what the sort of the thought processes they've gone through to get there. And demonstrating that leadership, the traits that we would expect to see of good leaders, and modelling those in their own behaviour and treating others with respect. And why I've shared this is because I appreciate, unless you've ever been on a governing body, it can seem like one of those scary sorts of sets of meetings that we hope never to actually be in. But actually, it's important sometimes to understand what these people do and the frameworks within which they work if we want to try and affect any sort of change there. So that's just why I share that. And I do encourage you, if you're not aware of the governing structure around your university, do try and find out a little bit more about how that works and who is involved, because those can be the people that actually will listen. Indeed, one of their roles is to listen to colleagues such as yourselves about the things that are really important within the university. And that obviously includes holistic student development. So in terms of the role of governance, I think it's important that we consider a number of questions. Why do we have governance? As we've talked about, the governance is the governors themselves are external people appointed by an organisation to represent the best interests, to uphold and maintain that integrity, and to be challenging on a points, to be that constructive friend, asking the right questions, and for the considerations that we're thinking about today, to ask the right questions around, are we doing the right thing in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion? Are we ensuring equity for everybody involved in our university? And we think about how our institution is governed. So again, I encourage you, go away and have a look at your institution. If you can find out, it's normally published somewhere how your organisation is governed. So just worth knowing about who's in that space, who are the people that are really involved in those kind of discussions. And that is really important because actually that leads us on to thinking about actually what would we need to do if we wanted to talk to our governors, to make our governors understand that there is something really important for us to be thinking about. And again, in the context of today, we're thinking about holistic student development, recognising that students develop in all sorts of different ways, and that development comes from all sorts of different parts of the university, not just about being sat in the classroom. So whilst we've thought a bit about governance, the actual way that we might start to articulate plans for holistic student development might be through things like our policies and our strategic plans. And our governors, our governing body, our governance structures are those bodies that sign off those plans and that will keep checking that they're working. So you can start to see how the two link together. Have a think, like I've already said, about the policies that might exist within your institution and your university. Do you maybe have a strategic plan? I know I do. And it's one of those documents that we often go back to when we demonstrate how what we're doing on a daily basis actually reflects and is helping to develop activity against our strategic plan. The reason for knowing these kind of things, knowing your plans and your policies, is because actually these can be really good starting points for you to spark a discussion in a really informed way to say, actually, we've got these plans. We're perhaps not necessarily demonstrating that we're doing all the things that they say they should at the minute, or actually that there's some really key bits missing in this plan. And I want to be part of the next time that these plans and policies are discussed and reviewed so that I can contribute my own expertise in this space. And again, this is where we need to remember that being holistic is really important, because actually bringing all of those teams together, making sure that we're all in alignment is really key if we're doing this holistically. So thinking about this from your own context, have a think about, do you know where to look for your policies and your plans? Have a think about, what do they cover? Are there any gaps in what they cover? If there are gaps, not always everybody likes to be told that there's a gap. So how might you tactfully, carefully share that information with others? And again, another reason for working with other people in a holistic way is because often people can come together and sort of come up with the most diplomatic way of raising those concerns. And think about how you're going to take that forward. We might ask ourselves, how do we consider policy? So how do our policies explain our approach to holistic student development? Now, you may find that when you're looking at some of your policies and the ways things that work, then actually you don't see the term holistic student development. So some of the time it's about reading into it. Oh, is that what it means? Others of the time you might think, actually there is something missing. We haven't really talked about holistic student development. We've talked about some skills in academic writing, maybe supporting students with maths if they need to do some data work or statistics. But actually, have we looked at the whole piece? Have we thought about that student's journey from the moment they join us right through all of the different things that they might experience and the things that might be useful as part of that development? And how can that be better articulated through our policies? And then, of course, we can consider again, who is involved? So if you find your policies, you'll often find that it tells you which team, it may even mention an individual person, who's actually written those policies. And from that, you can start to understand who might have influenced those policies. Ask around your colleagues as well. You know, they may know, they may recall when it was last looked at, when it was last updated, and who was involved. And it's important to think about these things because we can think about, is there a consistency of approach in terms of how we adapt and use and embrace our policies across an institution? And are we all actually doing the same things? Are we all championing our policies, particularly if we're working holistically to develop student development in the same way? So important things to consider and things to hopefully take away and ponder over after today's session. So let's think about back to that why question that we started with at the very top of the session. Why do we want to take a holistic approach to student development? We might want to do it because we recognise it may improve the experiences, and that might be for our students and our colleagues, learning and attainment, hopefully, and also well-being as well. And I'm sure there are many more things we can add to this list. And taking holistic approaches often has benefits for a number of different stakeholders. So your students are probably the people you're thinking about doing this for, but actually what you often find is actually there are benefits to be had by making changes, by making enhancements for your practitioners or your programs. So by practitioners, I mean people who may be in the classroom, your tutors, your technicians, people who are doing the work of supporting student development. And also there are likely to be benefits as well for your university, your institution, your provider, or indeed if you're from a students' union, you may adapt similar approaches. So sometimes the starting point can be thinking about who is it we're trying to benefit with this approach. And if we think about, well, who are we trying to benefit? Often that gives us a sense of, well, what would be a useful thing to do if we think that there's something more we could do to support student development. So let's think a little bit about pedagogy. And I know Paul's going to do a lot more on curriculum, so I shan't spend too long on this. But when we think about doing anything holistically, we do need to think and make sure that everybody is working towards the same goals holistically. And those goals may be set out in policy, the places where we write down what it is we're all collectively striving for. And it's through those governance structures, we've talked about our governing bodies, where those kind of policies are approved, they're championed, they're reviewed, and they're scrutinised as well. So very quickly, what do I actually mean by pedagogy? And now I appreciate, and I fully hold my hands up, that there are a whole load of terms within the world of pedagogy and pedagogic research that can be quite off-putting. So I'm not going to go down a heavy pedagogic presentation today, but let me just give you a few sort of key definitions. There are lots of definitions around actually what pedagogy is, but keeping it at the top level, we're thinking about the methods and the practice of teaching. Often it's considered an academic subject or a theoretical concept. But what I want to do is to share with you a couple of examples, universal design for learning, inclusive education, just as prompts, just as things you might think about. But to recognise that whilst these come from maybe a pedagogic approach, it's not just academic colleagues and educators who are involved in this activity. The best way you can have any sort of impact on student development is this approach, bringing in all those other people with all of those expertise and skills, a whole provider approach. And I'll talk more about what that means, particularly in an English context, in a moment. So I'm going to share a couple of examples with you. Again, feel free to take these away and have a look at them. I just share them as a couple of examples. We talked about resources earlier and recognising that there are lots of things that exist in the sector, so you don't need to start afresh. These are just prompts that may help you. You may find that some are more useful, that resonate more with you than others. One concept is a concept called universal design for learning. This concept looks at the idea that actually we all learn in different ways. So, for example, a method of teaching that supports one student's learning may not be very impactful for another student. And I'm sure we can all think of times where we've seen that in the classroom, where something really works for one student, but the person next to them still hasn't got a clue what you're talking about. So you need to try and think of ways to adapt. And universal design for learning recognises that and provides a framework that as we are designing our learning experiences and our learning environments, that might be in the class, online, a mixture, whatever that looks like, ensuring that those learning environments are accessible to everybody, that they are inclusive for everybody, and that they're challenging as well, that they spark some interest and some challenge as we think about learning. And the idea of universal design for learning is that it supports individual development to enhance their capacity to make choices in terms of their learning journey. Now, I'm going to sort of suggest that colleagues do go away and have a look at this again. The links are in the slides, and I do hope you'll get these, because this is available in a range of different formats, in different languages as well. So you can think about this in a way that best suits you. And the framework basically has sort of 3 rows and 3 columns. So the 3 columns invite the learning designer to think about engagement, how your students are going to engage, what might be represented, and action and expression. And the 3 rows invite us to think about access, support, and executive function. And I'm not going to go through these in detail today, but again, I just highlight this as a model that you may want to consider. And as I say, it is available in various different formats and languages. So again, do have a look at this if this is something that you're thinking about, oh, you know, there's something we could be doing better in our classroom or more holistically across the institution. This can be a model to guide you on that journey. Another model that, again, I will just touch on, again, more detail in your slides, is an approach called inclusive education. And there was a piece of work led by Hubbard and Gawthorpe in 2023 in the UK, and their definitions are on the screen. So they say that inclusive education recognises that all students should have an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background, their demographic characteristics, or certain circumstances. And I think that's probably something we would all subscribe to and recognise as well. From that project, they developed a framework, and they recognise that all students benefit from living in a diverse and inclusive society and engaging in that diverse and inclusive way of learning as part of their education. that our students will become our leaders of tomorrow. So actually we need to do work to embed those values that they can then take on into whatever it is that they may do next. And that being inclusive means that all students have an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background or their particular characteristics. So I think it's really important to recognise this framework as well, again, just as something that might prompt your thinking, because it can be quite useful to realise that a lot of this thinking work is done for you, and actually these could be guidelines as you start to consider further holistic development. So from that same project by Hubbard and Gawthorpe, that the framework demonstrates that there isn't no single solution for inclusivity, and that everybody is involved in thinking about this. That it recognises that actually lots of different people across a university are involved in thinking about an educational experience being inclusive. The students themselves, our academics, our technicians, our professional services colleagues, and our university leaders. All of us need to be modelling and representing this activity, and recognising that the learning development journey, as we would describe any student's learning journey, is just that. It is a journey. They will go on those journeys. They might cycle back round at points and develop new ideas and new things. But this understanding and this concept is constantly evolving. We also recognise that there are 6 key principles within this framework, so really important to implement these wherever possible. And similarly, they go on to explain a framework in this manner. Now, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because there are various different examples of this within the inclusive education framework. And what's quite useful if you're thinking about your position in terms of your contribution to inclusive education, there are checklists, if you like, to think about, have I been inclusive? There's a checklist for me as an educator, for somebody who teaches in a classroom. There's a checklist for a programme team, so thinking about that programme, that course experience. But there's also a checklist for senior leaders as well. So really nice to see that they've already done a lot of that work to think about how the inclusive approach might be holistic. I mentioned the whole provider approach, and I've mentioned as well the Office for Students. Now, these are the body in England that is our higher education regulator, and they require us in England to have an access and participation plan that sets out how we are going to improve the equality of opportunity for our students, essentially for students from a disadvantaged background, to ensure that they can access, succeed, and progress from higher education. And I just want to share that with you because I think that's really useful to know that we actually have an English requirement that makes us have to look at this. So in a way, perhaps it's a little bit easier in an English context because there is a requirement that we are looking at equity and equitable approaches to education. So again, I encourage you to think about, is there something within your context that actually requires you to think about this? Because if there is, that can be a good way to engage your governing body, because obviously they will want to make sure that you're meeting those external requirements. And as I come towards the end of my presentation, I want to just draw together a few final thoughts. Why might we integrate student development in the curriculum, for example? And I'm sure Paul will give us a few more examples of this in a moment. But essentially, taking some ideas from a qualitative assurance agency project that I led around embedding mental wellbeing, what we realised was there's benefits for taking these sorts of approaches for all different people. For our students, they may improve their achievement and their attainment, their sense of belonging, which we know actually has positive impacts on attainment often, their communication and confidence, and those sorts of examples that you see on screen. But there's also benefits, as I've mentioned before, for our practitioners, our people who are actually doing it, not only in seeing that student achievement, but actually in the activity that's happening in the class, the engagement that you're able to achieve, your own confidence and sense of your own well-being as well in that setting. And for our institutions, our universities and our organisations, recognising that we are compliant with policies that are internal and possibly external regulations as well, that we're ensuring successful award outcomes and equitable access opportunities. So really important to think about the benefits to everybody involved. Where might we look to holistically integrate student development? a range of examples on your screen. Teaching and learning, obviously, lots of different ways we might think about bringing those holistic ideas all together, thinking about activity that embeds skills development and engages learners embedded within your taught activity. Reflection activities with prompts, getting students to identify their strengths and areas for development. Really good way for them to think about what they could be working on to develop next. But really key, make sure we're supporting our staff and modelling these kind of approaches in everything we do. We might integrate activity in assessment, for example, and we've already talked quite a lot today about activity across the university as we build on our strategies and policies. Transitions are really key points, those points where something changes. We often talk about transitions into, through, and beyond higher education, but they're really natural points for reflection and forward planning. So it can be useful to think about student development at that point and getting them to think about what next. And similarly, work-based learning experiences. So if you have placement opportunities, real-world projects, opportunities for guest lecturers coming in, again, times to pause and plan and think about what could student development look like. So I hope that's been a useful exploration of all things to do with policy and governance and how we might start to approach pedagogy for holistic student development. We've recognised the reasons who might be involved in recognising holistic student development, the resources and the methods available. We've explored the role of institutional policy and governance in terms of the equity in student development, and we've considered some of the pedagogic methods as well, and why and where we might seek to integrate student development. So thank you very much for your patience and your engagement today. I hope that has provided some useful prompts, and I look forward to the discussions that I'm sure we'll have later on.
Thank you so much, Zoe. As a student in this, I think I didn't know as much, but the expose that you have laid, in front of us is like there is not just, and I was really impressed by the idea of the whole provider approach, because for something to come together, each and every component, be it the institutional structure, the whole ecosystem has to be aligned to a certain purpose to bring that about. And you very clearly outlined how the policy, the strategic vision, the structures, the operations, the governance models, the implementation plans, the operating procedures, how they all down to the class, and then to the classroom, the curriculum, the pedagogy, and even then to the assessment, and so many other areas, how the same theme has to carry to create that critical impact, and then only will it be sustainable. That was marvelous, the way you made us think. And I was thinking that a lot of us are university faculty, and I was like thinking as one of them that why do I need to know all of this? And I have realized that there are so many times we are flummoxed and disgruntled and dissatisfied with something that we do that does not seem to make any end result. And the outcome is not what we thought would happen. And I think your presentation made me realize that for my effort to come through to the end that I want has to be a whole gallery of stakeholders to be involved towards that same vision. And while you were talking, I was perhaps going away from the camera and I was scribbling those notes because they were so, let me say for myself, it was mind-boggling in some ways that I hadn't thought of, but mind openers as well. And I was like, aha, these are the reasons that we need to know as faculty, because we are leaders in the classroom, academic leaders, and we will be leading some committees, some bodies, some of the institutions. So we need to be aware of every single component that counts towards that effort. We have to be mindful, and then only. And I think as we talk about the institution, that's a small microcosm of what's happened in the community. And so the whole thing carries over to community and beyond as well. So must say for me, it was like an aha moment so many times. And thank you so much for the remarkable work you have done. And you put the big picture very beautifully. You laid out the whole big picture landscape you touched upon the UDL framework and the inclusive education. We use them over here, but again, Zoe, I've seen that every framework needs changes due to the context in which it is applied. And I think that is what I have noticed, that if we want to apply West-centric sort of approaches on they will not go anywhere and they'll not be impactful. So for our audiences, wherever they are in different parts of the world, and there are some I see from, from America and from I've seen some from Central Asia, I'm not sure. But we need to be mindful of our context. So our ecosystems in which our campus thrives lives in the bigger ecosystem, that's the community, and we have to be mindful of those factors. I'm very, very excited and moving forward to our next speaker. He's, like I said, a professor of higher education in the Department of Educational Research, Lancaster University. And Paul, if I'm not wrong, you were traveling or something and you landed just in time for this session, or maybe I'm mixing you up, because we did have one such speaker who said, I'll be arriving some hours before your talk, and so it will be a bit of a hustle and bustle. So, and I see that you're going to talk about the curriculum and how and that will be very, very interesting for the educators that are here, because these, I think more than now 300 faculty want to have those hands-on ideas about what the curriculum can do to bring about all that Zoe said needs to be done for a whole person. So very, very excited in moving forward towards you. G. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll just share my slides.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can see those now.
Yes.
Great,
Absolutely.
thank you. So lovely to be here. Great to see so many people at this session. I think I've got a bit of a job of work to follow Zoe's really impressive presentation, and also to convince you about why the curriculum's important. I'm sure for lots of you coming to this session, there might be a sense of, well, why does the curriculum matter? The curriculum's fixed. The knowledge we give students access to is the knowledge we give students access to. And what I want to try and do in this session is to really disrupt that thought, is really to encourage you to see the curriculum as something that changes, and also as something that we're collectively responsible for, and also something that plays a key role in addressing educational inequalities. So for me, a lot of this work comes from a question about what is our vision for higher education? What do we think higher education is for? And for me, this, what higher education and higher education institutions, universities, colleges, other institutions, what they do is they look after knowledge for society. Their role is to be stewards of knowledge. So some institutions produce knowledge, but what nearly all higher education institutions do is they give students access to knowledge. They say to students, look, we've got this really important knowledge that we think could do something in your lives. Come and join us, come and share with us in this knowledge. And the central question for me is, how do we develop an inclusive, transformative higher education system rather than an elitist reproductive one? And those two sets of couples are deliberate. For me, if you have an elitist education system, it's always reproductive. If you say, what I want to do is I want to find the brightest and the best, that's my educational mission, you will end up identifying the privilege, because everyone wants their children to do well. And if you've got more resources, it's easier for your child to do well. There's no conspiracy. It's simply people wanting the best for the people they love. But what that means is that you end up, if you have an elitist system, reproducing existing inequalities. Whereas for me, what education should be doing is finding the ability in everyone, finding out how everyone can make a contribution to society. And if we're going to build inclusive societies, then we need everyone. We need to collectively come together and draw on the strength of our diversity in order to make changes in society. And I would argue, and I will carry on arguing, that inequalities in access to knowledge play a central role in educational inequalities. The fact that different people have access to different kinds of knowledge play a central role in the reproduction of inequalities in society. Oops. So what that leads me to focus on is this idea of curriculum. Now, as I've said, you might be kind of wondering, well, why is this guy going on about curriculum? We have a curriculum, it's the same every year, that's what we do, you know, and you know, if I'm teaching a curriculum on biology, then research in biology just comes into the curriculum, and that's really straightforward. To disrupt that idea, I draw on the work of a British sociologist of education, Basil Bernstein, who had this notion of the pedagogic device. This is, how does knowledge work at the level of society? And he says it works in three different ways. So we have the production of knowledge. Knowledge is research. When we do research, we produce knowledge. And then we have knowledge as curriculum. And the key thing that Bernstein argues is that when knowledge moves from being something that we research to a curriculum, it's transformed. The knowledge that is in the curriculum is not the same as the knowledge we produce in research. So first of all, there's selection. You can't have the whole of research in your curriculum. You have to decide which parts of knowledge come in to that curriculum. And that is a power struggle. Who gets to say? You know, you might in the course that you teach, there's a part of that course that's always taught every year by this really powerful person, and it can't possibly change because that's how they teach it. That's a power struggle. That's an example of how what gets included in the curriculum is shaped by power struggles within a particular institution. As well as thinking about what the knowledge is from research, as you design a curriculum, you also think about, well, who are our students? How do we make this knowledge accessible to our students? And that might change the order in which you present things in your curriculum. So the idea that the curriculum is fixed is actually one that I would argue strongly against. And actually, it's something that we have choice over in the way that we structure it. And then thirdly, knowledge is transformed again as students engage with it. As students start to learn a new area, as they start to study a part of biology, it doesn't enter their minds in a way that's completely unaltered. As they study it, they change it, they relate it to what they've learned before, they develop a new understanding of it. And what we need to do as educators is make sure their understanding is aligned with what we're trying to teach. And this is really important, because if this wasn't the case, knowledge would never change. Knowledge would never move forward. The fact that people reinterpret knowledge and see it in different ways is what leads to advances in knowledge. So the key things about this idea of curriculum is, first of all, that knowledge is transformed as it moves between contexts, but also that as it's moved and as it's transformed, we have power struggles in terms of what knowledge gets selected, who gets access to that knowledge, and what they can do with that kind of knowledge. Oops, sorry, I've got a dodgy mouse today. So to say a bit more about this, I'm going to draw on some research. So to tell you a bit about myself, I'm someone who has the absolute privilege of researching higher education. The stuff that I do is focused on the education that's offered through different forms of higher education. And over the years, I've been involved in 2 longitudinal studies. So the first was just based in England, where we looked at sociology degrees in 4 institutions in England, and we tracked students through their degrees to see how they were given access to knowledge. And in that study, we had two institutions that are always seen as the best institutions for sociology and two institutions who are always seen as amongst the worst institutions for sociology. And we compared students' journeys into sociology and how those different degrees gave students access to knowledge. And what we found is that one of the universities that was always considered good and one of the sociology degrees that was always seen as problematic, in fact, offered a higher quality education than the other two. So this idea that educational reputation or league table ranking tells us nothing about educational quality. It's simply not a measure of educational quality. And then a follow-on project from that, we looked at chemistry and chemical engineering in 2 English, 2 South African and 2 US universities. And in this study, we in fact tracked students for 7 years. So when they entered their undergraduate studies through to up to 3 or 4 years after graduation, looking at the ways in which they came into relationship to knowledge and the impact of the curriculum on their understanding of chemistry and chemical engineering. And I'm going to draw on that research to kind of build the argument that I want to make today. So if we're looking for a higher education that overcomes educational inequalities, I would argue that needs to be a transformative experience of higher education for those students. And I would argue that if we want higher education that's transformative, then this is about designing ways in which particular students can develop an understanding of particular bodies of knowledge. It's about the knowledge that students study, but it's also designing the curriculum in such a way as it gives the students we have access to that forms of knowledge. So, you know, a very, very old educational principle is first find out what the student knows and then teach them accordingly. You know, so we always have to take into account the current understanding of our students rather than saying, oh, they're the wrong kind of student. If only we had the right kind of student, education would be brilliant. Often people can get in this way of talking as if, you know, really education would work brilliantly if only there weren't students. And it's also worth bearing in mind that as long as there's been writing about education, students have been seen as to be not as good as they used to be. You know, as long as you look back at education, there's a sense that somehow students used to be brilliant and they're now not. And you can find that whenever you find writing about education. So we need to recognise that sense that somehow students aren't as good as they used to be is always with us, and kind of say, okay, no, but what we need to do is we need to focus on the students we have. And we need to focus on the students we have and give them a transformational educational experiences that changes their sense of who they are through their engagement with knowledge, who changes who they are and what they can do in the world. So when we're saying to students, come and study with us, we have knowledge that can do amazing things in your lives, we're saying, look, this knowledge will take you somewhere. You'll relate who you are to this knowledge and you'll see the world differently. You'll engage in the world differently. And for me, that's our responsibility as educators. That doesn't mean that students won't do things we don't expect. What students do with the knowledge is entirely up to them. But as educators, we need to know where we think it's going to take them. Otherwise, why are we making promises to them about the value of the education that we offer? So that's our responsibility as educators, but students have a responsibility as well. They need to understand that they're part of an educational process. They need to understand that in order to benefit from the knowledge that they're studying, they need to change. And that depends on the student and it depends on the quality of their educational experience. But if we want to break down educational inequalities, then we really need to think carefully about how are we giving students access to knowledge? How do we expect students to be able to understand the things we're taking, you know, the knowledge we want to give them access to? How do we design a path that will take our students from where they are currently to the understanding that we want them to achieve? So this is a diagram that kind of represents the way in which I think about the transformational power of higher education. So we have students who are looking to engage with the world, but what higher education does is it takes them in relationship to these collective bodies of knowledge. And it's really important to see this knowledge as, you know, all bodies of knowledge in higher education are the collective achievement of thousands of people over thousands of years. You know, that's what knowledge is. Knowledge has a structure, it's collective. And it's that collective structure that enables students to be transformed and to see the world differently. Not everything students do in relation to higher education is related to their course. So there's also a link between students and the world. But the fundamental thing that higher education does is take students in relation to collective bodies of knowledge that allows them to see themselves and the world differently. And so to give you a kind of sense of what I mean by this transformational experience, this is a quote from a student we gave the pseudonym Esther to in the sociology project that I talked about. And Esther says, "There's no destination with this discipline. There's always something further. And there is no point where you can stop and say, I understood. I'm a sociologist. The thing is, sociology makes you aware of every decision you make, how that would impact on my life and how it could impact on someone else's. And it makes that decision harder to make." And what I really like about this quote from Esther and why I'm sharing it with you is that it gives a sense of how when you gain things through higher education, you also lose things. So Esther has this sense of she's really gained from understanding sociology, but actually the world suddenly become a more difficult place. She's suddenly more aware of the impact of her decisions on other people. So this is an example of a kind of transformational relationship to knowledge, where Esther's engagement with the bodies of knowledge of sociology have changed who she is and what she can do in the world. Now, when we were reporting on this project, we'd share these findings with people and they'd say things like, yeah, but that's sociology, Paul. That's what you'd expect in sociology. It's not a real subject like other subjects. And that's kind of part of what inspired the project looking at chemistry and chemical engineering. So here's a quote from a chemistry student from that project in which this student, who we gave the pseudonym Donna, says, I'll observe something which to someone who doesn't do chemistry, they'll just see it for what it is. But then in my mind, I just start thinking about the theory behind why that's working. Sometimes the science element kind of goes off in my brain and I start analysing things in that kind of way. Because I mean, science, it's great to know, but it's not purely for the benefit of knowledge. We want knowledge, but then we want to see how we can use that knowledge and how we can apply it and improve things. And so again, this for me is an example of how Donna's been transformed by her engagement with the knowledge of chemistry. And again, the reason for using this quotation and sharing it with you is because what Donna does really nicely is she steps across ideas that of knowledge as application versus knowledge as personal meaning. You know, Donna wants to generate personal meaning from this knowledge, but she also wants to apply it. So it's not just about pure knowledge, it's about what we can do with knowledge in the world. So in both these projects, we looked at, okay, so what things seem to support students to see their subject in a way that was transformational. And what we found was in both of these projects is that where students' understanding was supported, where students felt that they were supported to develop their understanding, then they tended to see knowledge in transformational ways. So as I've already mentioned, they needed to understand that what they were doing in higher education is they were engaging with the subject. You know, yes, they were making friends, yes, they were doing external activities, but they actually understood they were in higher education to engage with an education, and they were there to engage with the subject. So that was really important. And then also they needed to have a sense of where their subject would take them and how it would allow them to get there. Sometimes students kind of saw what they were studying as something that was intellectually interesting, but completely disconnected from the world. And actually, these students tended to also struggle to see the relevance of what they were studying. So yes, they needed to engage with their subject, but they also need to have a sense of what that subject could help them to do in the world. As I've said a number of times, they then had to see this as an educational experience, and they also kind of needed to understand that their relationship with their degree program was two-way, that there was responsibilities for them, but there was also something that was offered by the education they were offered. And to give you a kind of sense of that distinction I'm making there, I want to kind of give you two quotations from two students in that chemistry project. So we have a quote from Hayden in which Hayden says, "I suppose educationally it's down to me. They can't drag me to a table and make me work, or drag me into university and make me sit through lectures. They've not got any kind of responsibility or right to a certain degree, because if I want a day off, I can have a day off. I pay for it. That's the way I see it." Whereas Mwandi says, "A university degree is valuable because it allows you to think in a way that a person who doesn't have a degree wouldn't think. All these parts in your brain that wouldn't be at any time unlocked or unleashed or ever, universities allow you to reach those parts." And what we found is that students like Hayden, who kind of said, well, it's just me on my own, tended to struggle more than students like Mwandi, who understood this was a two-way relationship between their degree program, between their institution, and between them as students. And that sense of that's what an education involves, and students understanding that as an education is really important. And that, again, is part of our role as educators, is to help students to see that engaging in education in certain ways is more likely to lead to them to have high quality outcomes. And that's one of the things about instrumentalism, where students are very instrumental about their education. What we need to help them to understand is that actually instrumentalism won't support them to engage with knowledge. And if they don't get access to knowledge, then they won't benefit from the education that they're engaging with. So if we ask the question about, okay, so I've talked a bit about transformational relationships to knowledge. I've talked a bit about how access to knowledge in that way is important to address inequalities. What kind of curricula? So as I've said, we have knowledge of the discipline that's generated through research, then transformed into a curriculum, and what kind of curriculum help to break down education inequalities. And these points are based on the work of Zoe Allan Shea, and that reference there is to an open access article that I wrote in honor of Zoe Allan Shea when she sadly died. So this is kind of my interpretation of Zoe Allan Shea's ideas. So if we think about what kind of curricula break down education inequalities, then the first thing is that they're designed for the diversity of students entering university, enabling them to have successful educational experiences and supporting their progression. So as I've kind of already hinted at, if we're saying to students, come and study with us, then we have a responsibility to make what we're offering them accessible. We need to understand what their current understanding is, understand where they're at, and then design an educational experience that takes them to where we want them to be able to go with the knowledge they're engaging with. So that sense of starting with the students you really have, rather than the students you wished you had, or the students you had 5 years ago, or the students they have in the top universities in the country. No. Who are your students? How are you designing things for those particular students? Then secondly, curricula that are relevant to the rapidly changing world that students graduate into and prepare them for employment rather than preparing them for an idealized version of the world. So for most students, many students coming into higher education, they are concerned about what they're going to be able to do afterwards. For many students, they're paying, their families are putting everything they have into giving these students an opportunity to study. They need to know where that's going to take them, and not in a kind of sense of, oh, if the world was perfect, you'd be able to do this, but in a sense of, given the current state of the world, where are students going to be able to, what are students going to be able to do with this knowledge? And sometimes that's about, higher education institutions being clear about what their graduates actually go on and do. Sometimes they just pick famous graduates, or they say, oh yeah, we got 3 students into multinationals, but they don't actually look at most of their students and what do they do with that knowledge. And actually thinking about that can also help us to think about how we might redesign our curriculum in order to support students to make a contribution to the world. Then thirdly, curricula that take the voices and experiences of students seriously and recognise and make use of the rich sources of knowledge in and about the context that students are coming from through the languages of students. So this kind of relates back to something Zoe was saying, is students have expertise. How do we make use of that expertise in designing our courses? Now, sometimes people can do this in a way they say, oh, my students know as much as I do. They're the experts. And my reaction to that is, well, if they're the experts, why are you getting paid to teach them and why are they paying to be taught? So no, we have expertise that our students don't have, that they're coming to higher education to access to. But that doesn't mean they don't have any expertise. So how do we take account of the things they do know? How, when we're designing our curriculum, do we relate it to the things they currently know in their language in order to help them to make sense of the new languages that we want to bring them into relationship to? Fourthly, curricula that challenges misuses of power by academics that demean, exclude and discriminate against some students. Education is not always a welcoming environment for all students. There are plenty of students who feel excluded by the practices of academics. Now, in a way, when humans interact, there's always a sense that people sometimes feel excluded, but our job as educators is to make as much effort as we can to make all students feel that they're welcomed and they're taken seriously and that we're really focused on how to help them, rather than dismissing them as the wrong kind of student or creating barriers where there don't need to be barriers. So, again, as I've said, if we're inviting students on to a program to study with us, then we need to think about what commitment that gives us to those students and how we're taking account of their situation. If we say, yes, you can be a carer and study our course, or yes, you can be working and study our course, then we can't then say to them, oh, well, we're not making any allowance for that. Actually, if we're saying to them, yes, you can study with us, then we need to work out how we make allowances for the situations of the students that we're taking onto our programs. And then fifthly, curricula that help to break barriers of inequalities by redistributing knowledge and by challenging and changing existing knowledge structures. So for me, there's two, that I kind of have a kind of two-way relationship with the bodies of knowledge that we give students access to. One, we give them access to them because they're powerful and because we think they can enable students to do things in the world, but also to recognise that sometimes those bodies of knowledge set up barriers and kind of ideas around the decolonisation of the curriculum, really make us think about, well, which part of this particular curriculum is there because it's important to the knowledge and which part is actually just about excluding people. And that's a really challenging thing to think about that has to be done on an ongoing basis. And again, as I've said, collectively with our colleagues, with other people in our institution, with students, with those outside of our institution, really trying to think about seriously about this knowledge and in which ways is it including and in which ways is it excluding. So, as will be I hope will be clear from what I'm saying, this makes ideas of curriculum enhancement really, really important. A lot of educational development in higher education focuses on changing individuals, kind of has a view that, oh, well, if we change the new teachers coming in, then we'll change the whole of the workforce of higher education. It doesn't work. It's what my PhD supervisor called the where there's death, there's hope strategy of change. That once all of the people who are in the way move on, and then the young people come in, then somehow we'll have change. But actually what happens is, because of all of those established people have the power, then the people who are coming in just change to be like the people who have power. So for me, there's a real issue with academic development. Clearly, helping people as an individual teacher to work out how to develop their practice is useful. But if we want sustained change, then I would argue what we need to change is the curriculum. We need to, because then if we change the curriculum, because the curriculum has a textual form that is sustained over time, then it gives us a way of sustaining change. Whereas if we change individuals and they leave the organisation, then all of that effort is gone. It's no longer sustainable once people leave. So I would argue a key task is to support the development of degree programmes that are well designed and based on evidence-informed views, as I've emphasised, who the students are, who really are the students, and how are our programmes designed for those particular students. Secondly, how and why the knowledge which students are offered access to is important and powerful, how it enables them to understand and change the world. So we should be able to look at our curriculum and say, why is that in there? Why have we decided to do a module or a set of sessions on this topic? And if we can't answer that question, or if the answer is, oh, because that module's always been taught by this powerful person, or that's how we've always done it, it's not good enough. We need to have an educational reason for why we're including what we're including in our curriculum. And then finally, who do we think students will become through this engagement with knowledge? How will they contribute to society? Yes, in their employment, but also more widely. And as I've said, we as educators can never predict what our students will do with the knowledge we give them access to. They can do anything they like with it, but we do have a responsibility to think about what we think it will enable them to do. What do we think that studying with us for a sustained period of time, studying these things, where will that take students? And, what's our evidence for thinking it will take them there? And as I've said, this is really difficult. This is difficult collective intellectual work that we sometimes do something, we make a change and it doesn't work. Or we might redesign our curriculum, it might work brilliantly for 5 years and then suddenly it stops working because something's changed, the knowledge changed or the students have changed. So this sense of giving students access to knowledge is a lifelong vocation. It's not something where a few tips and changes makes it perfect. No, education is never perfect. The educational philosopher Gert Biester talks about the beautiful weakness of education, that the only way you can make education strong and predictable is by taking all of the education out of it. If you have a truly educative environment, then students may or may not make use of that. And that's what education does. It has this inherent weakness that makes it beautiful, that makes it have this transformational potential. So to finish with some more practical things, because I realise I've been talking at quite a high level of abstraction, not particularly grounded in the experiences that you have, and I hope that the questions you put in the chat will give me a sense of some of those contexts. But I've got some questions here that are intended if you're looking at a curriculum and trying to think about, well, does it work? Does it give students access to, transformational access to knowledge? How might we redesign it? And the idea is that we aren't, for any program, these are answered collectively by groups of people together, including students, teachers, those who support students, employers come together to think about this idea of curriculum design. So the first question, on what basis has knowledge been selected for inclusion in this curriculum? And who's had a say in selecting this knowledge? And I know in some contexts, actually, there is no choice. There is a curriculum that's been decided at higher level than you work at, and you've got to do what they say. But sometimes there is a choice in selecting it. So on what basis has it been selected? And then secondly, What account has been taken of who the students are and what they know in designing the curriculum? Is it the same curriculum that's used across the whole of the world without taking any account of the student? In which case, I would struggle to see how that's educational. Clearly, teachers will work hard to make it educational, but it's not a great set start for an educational process if it's seen as changing regardless of who the students are. Third, how will those teaching the programme use their expertise to support students' engagement with these bodies of knowledge? And I think it's really important that as educators, we own our expertise. We recognise what we have to offer students, and we recognise the limits of that, and we think carefully about how we deploy that educationally in order to give students access to knowledge. And then what other resources, including other students, teaching and learning interactions, readings, technologies, how are we going to use other resources to support this engagement? So really kind of thinking about, we want these students coming from this place to understand this knowledge that will take them to this other place. How do we design it? How do we design a set of experiences that make that journey realistic? You know, on what basis do we have confidence that this student starting here will end up where we hope they will end up? Then, if we think about students engaged with that knowledge, how and why is it expected to lead to new ways of thinking and doing for the students? What will this knowledge give them that they don't have beforehand? Then sixthly, clearly assessment is really, really important. There's a quote that in fact one of the participants in one of the teachers who were involved in the chemistry and chemical engineering project I mentioned said, he said, students can escape bad teaching, but they can't escape bad assessment. So if you say, for example, set up a beautifully designed course that brings students into a powerful relationship to knowledge, that transforms the way they see themselves and engage with the world, and then you assess that by a multiple choice questionnaire, then you're completely contradicting the rest of your design. So how is your assessment designed in a way that is actually aligned with your educational intentions? If what you want students to be able to do is to be able to show how they've developed a powerful relationship to knowledge, how does your assessment support that? Because, students are just like anyone else. They look at how they're assessed and they think, okay, what do I need to do in order to meet this assessment? And if your assessment doesn't make them do the things you want them to do educationally, then you're suffering from bad design. Because, in the same way for us as educators, when we're really rushed, when we're really busy, we think, what things do I have to do? What are the things I need to do? And students studying a course are exactly the same. They have busy lives, they have many things going on. So we need the assessment to actually move them in the direction of our educational intentions. Otherwise, it won't work. And then finally, and most importantly, well, not most importantly, but importantly, what evidence are we using? So when we answer those first 6 questions, what's the evidence that our answer is based on? Do we have data from our teaching practices? Have we investigated our practices in some way? Have we read some research literature? Well, when we're making arguments with our colleagues and our students about how education should be designed, then we need to know what evidence there is that supports that. And again, this kind of reflects the kind of relationship to knowledge that I'm arguing for, is that these collective bodies of knowledge, both the programs that students study, but also knowledge about curriculum, are really powerful and they can help us to do things in the world. And our job as educators is to recognize the transformational power of that knowledge and to work out ways of giving all students access to it. And if we can do that, then we will help to address educational inequalities. We can never fully address them. Education can never make up for economic and social inequalities, but it can help to mitigate it if we find ways of giving all students access to the knowledge that we know is powerful, and we are very clear about what that knowledge will enable students to do in their lives. I'll finish there, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Paul. I have been on curriculum committees in my country. And believe me, when you talked, I realized I was the wrong person to sit on those. There's a whole science to what a curriculum is. How does it come about? Who are the stakeholders? Where our focus should be? What steps, are needed to make a transformative curriculum? And then, of course, the whole dynamics of the pedagogy, the assessments, the activities, and how they relate come together, to make it powerful and sustainable. I think more important that the things that resonate with me as I'm listening to you is that it has to be sustainable, and for that it has to be true to the purpose that you have set up your curriculum for. It could be different in different institutions, in different contexts, but how do you then, first of all, develop some things that's true to that context, and then how do you keep to it so that it really brings about impactful and sustainable change? Now, those were all very, again, for me, I do not know, I'm sure for many others, it was new learning for me, a lot of what you said, and I'm very, very thankful to each of you. But just to come back to our context, now, when I was listening to both of you, there was this context where the research comes from your part of the world. There's a lot that's happening on diversity long before we started even thinking about it. It's another story that we are diverse communities and we have lived very peacefully forever and ever. And now with new times, things seem to have brought about the ideas of the other, which were never there in my society. And growing up, I've seen that change. Now that's another discourse, how it happened and why it happened. But for now, in our countries, and I see in our country especially, and I see majority, I think nearly 300 plus are from Pakistani. If I may speak for all of them. Education at the level of which we are talking is the prerogative of only 9%. And that by itself makes it very elitist. And now, having said that, the idea of a curriculum that caters to an elitist group of people, by that virtue, and I don't want to make a statement, but let me say, is definitely not context relevant. And so I sometimes say, and forgive, I want to, please, for my open, that we are producing cogs for the international community. We are not producing them for our own context. Now, that is where leveling the playing field goes for a six for us. And so the struggle that we have is that we have these West-centric models, and they're very good, and they're resource, again, they need resources, and countries in the global South, we don't have those resources, be that the human capital or be that the infrastructure or others. And then what that does is that in an effort to do a patchwork of picking up some from the West and trying to do something that is relevant to our systems doesn't bode well with us. So the struggle remains. How do you, in our campuses, where the student body is diverse, but they are nevertheless come from a certain educated background that by virtue is elitist. They have had some education. I think 50% of our population never goes, the youth never go beyond secondary level of education. So those who reach higher education are a different class altogether. So how do you, even within that, the idea of we have to still, within what we have, I think the fact that we have to struggle to bring everybody together. As I said, in our society, the divisiveness is increasing. So we have to sort of bring everybody together. And Paul, what you said about starting with the voices of the students, and starting to understand what sort of information is relevant and required in our context, I think, to draft a curriculum that speaks to us, I think, is very, very important. And we take those points. Zoe talked about a whole lot of the wider policy and infrastructure dimensions. And I do see that applying those to our context will demand some sort of innovative thinking. We cannot apply them direct to our context per se, but we will have to do our own thinking at our own level with our own context. And that is where I urge my Pakistani academics counterparts that are joining now, that if you could ask questions that speak to you while you were listening to these two excellent speakers. I mean, the amount of learning that has happened has been monumental for me. And so thank you so much. So I open up the gallery, Fatma, if we have, I did not see many questions, except that many of them were complaining about not getting the Zoom link in time. And I apologize once again as to why it happened. I have no idea. We sent it out 15 hours ahead of the session, but we'll try to send them early. Here is a poll that's come on. Please do the questions. But if there are any questions, Fatma, we can take them on the side. Or if there are any comments, please raise your. I see two hands. Taskeen Zara from Fatma Jinnah Medical University, and I see from DHA University. Fatma, would you please unmute them so they can sort of ask those questions? Ji Taskeen, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, Paul. How are you doing? Great, insightful session, Paul, I must say. In fact, your beginning was really powerful, that told us how can we break those barriers for transformation and curriculum. Now, I was thinking of a few things which I am going through right now, especially if I work, say that we are trying to introduce entrepreneurship manual in the medical university, and we are greatly struggling upon that. Now, could you give some insightful tips where I can make this sustainable? How can I make this keep on rolling bubble, so that not only the students but the faculty is also at par with this? There's a great point, there's great thing which are constantly going on in our dogma. And please don't forget the political context over here. We have cultural constraints, we have political alignments as there, and I am in the public sector university. Now everything is most of the time trickle down. We are told you have to do this, and I have to trickle down, and we have to implement it. But the core thing is that anything which is good, we are happy to move to keep this thing sanity in mind. But if suddenly there's change in political leadership, there's change in political will, you have to take this thing back foot. My point is that how can you give some insightful can you give me some handful ideas that I keep those good things continuously going on with the momentum of changing society as well. So I give you an example. Pakistan has woken up really late on entrepreneurship and AI. Everything is now AI centered. Yes, I agree, AI centered. We have to incorporate everything in AI. We have to incorporate everything through LLMs. But that doesn't solve the issue until and unless you go back in the at very grassroots level. So please, could you give me few tips and few points to this? And I hope I've given a clear indication what I want to ask as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and yeah, that sense of incredibly complex context in which there are many things to consider, like as you've said, like the culture factors, the political factors, and working out how to do it in a sustainable way is really important. So the things I would say, in a way, are probably going to seem kind of small, but I think that's what we have to do with education. So the important things are to recognize what you're achieving already. From what you've said already, you're achieving a great deal. And so that sense of being kind to yourself and being realistic about what's possible in your context is really, really important. The second thing is to recognize what a blunt tool education is. So sometimes we can spend ages making what we consider to be big changes to our programs, and then the next cohort of students come through and they don't even notice that you've made the changes. And when I started being a university teacher, I'd spend hours and hours doing these sophisticated things and really trying to change things, and then they don't particularly have an effect. So for me, it's about, if you recognize that education is a blunt tool and you really focus on things like assessment, things like the order of things, the design of the curriculum, and kind of do what you can in those situations, using your expertise of the particular situation you're in, and then really importantly, working collectively to do it. None of us can do it on our own. Teaching is always collective. Even if we're teaching completely on our own, the bodies of knowledge we're teaching have been collectively produced. So teaching's never, ever an individual activity. So how do we work together with other people to achieve the small things we think are possible? And you know, a small amount of change is something that's really valuable. So don't underestimate that, and don't set yourself up with in comparison with something that's completely unachievable.
May I ask Zoe also to address that? I think it was a very good question. Those are those contextual struggles that we are going through in our country, and I can see the youth being a bit perplexed and drawn into different, directions. And so, Zoe, if you could give some sort of words there of it.
Thank you. I think Paul actually, towards the end of his summary there, was sort of saying exactly what I was thinking about, being collaborative. And I suppose that also draws back to that sense of being holistic as well, doesn't it? That we recognise what we're trying to achieve, but have a look at what else everybody else is trying to achieve. And we don't always call things by the same name. And that means often we find that we're actually all doing almost exactly the same thing, but because we've all termed it slightly differently, or we're all doing it in a slightly different way, we're not using our collective strength, if you like. So maybe have a look at the people around you. What are they doing? If you have a team meeting, with your colleagues, talk to them about what they're doing. And yeah, I think just you're obviously there's an awful lot of sector change, and I think that's one of the challenges, I'm going to say. I'm sure some people say the joy of higher education. There's always change. That's the only thing we can guarantee, isn't it, in higher education? Yes. So keeping aware of that, keeping mindful of that, being honest and recognizing that our students and our learners recognize that too, when they're not living in a silo that are hidden from it. But I think that collective approach is really key. So start locally, have those discussions within your teams. If you can't find people that are working on this locally, have a chat with your manager, or whatever your structure is. There may be other people working in slightly different disciplines who are thinking about similar things. So it's about finding your own networks as well to explore these ideas.
Yeah. If I may add, I think I have noticed that if you look at the big picture, then it becomes very daunting to chew it all. So I have noticed you start with small steps, do what you can do. If you can't do something that's beyond the scope, don't even pine over it. Because if you pine, you lose your energy that you could put into something that you were doing. So I tell myself, and I tell other people struggling with that same question, is that do your best, do what you can do. You are only accountable to yourself, and that's about it. And then let's hope that island, I think I have always noticed, Paul and Zoe, I'm sorry for taking that conversation away, that people who think similarly and are sincere somehow are also type A. They do not try to connect with others. I think it's the type B, the blustery ones who are loud, who will make a noise, who will get together, who then bang together to support each other. But these are the nice, quiet, simple, focused ones who want to run away from any sign of friction. And so we lose that connection with like-minded people like you and me. I think we need all sorts of voices to get together to bring a sort of, and we need to connect, not be islands within ourselves, but islands of excellence, I call them, but they are silos, and we need to connect sort of to bring about change. And that's what you're saying, Zoe, and I hope that helps you find some peace moving forward. I can see that you are young and you want to move very quickly and move the world. It takes time. And maybe it doesn't move at all. So there's something. We have Dr. Ahmed Hussain for a very long time. Ahmed from DHA, please unmute and do ask the question.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I'm very grateful for the wonderful talks. My question is more about pedagogy. We talk about teaching at schools and high schools, but university learning at higher institute teaching learning is much different. So we must start talking about the andragogy. We must think that the learner may be a visual learner, maybe an audio learner, or maybe a kinetic-static. So we need to think more about andragogy and talk about more andragogy when we're talking about teaching at universities. So I'd like to have a comments from our August speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, I think point taken. Nobody's going to disagree with that. Gee, Zoe, would you like to say something? And Paul?
I was going to say, I think this is one of those contextual things, actually, because just in sort of the spheres I'm sort of working in, we don't tend to use the phrase andragogy. We do sort of default to pedagogy. For anyone who's not quite sure, andragogy tends to think about teaching and learning practices in relation to adults. Pedagogy can be considered more sort of on sort of child learning. And I was thinking about that. I saw your comment in the chat, Dr. Ahmad, and I thought, actually, I think this comes back to my context because, as I said at the start, I work in an institution that is very much about widening participation. It's very much about welcoming learners who may otherwise not have gone to university, who are that first in family, perhaps from those sort of backgrounds that may have had more of a challenge in joining us at university. I think perhaps we do take that more holistic approach of we can't necessarily assume that they have got some scaffolded understanding about how to embrace learning, and we do perhaps take that more holistic approach. But I think this is one of those interesting things that it can just be to do with context as well.
Absolutely. Gee, Paul, did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And the thing I would say is what we're trying to do in education is to establish a relationship between students and the knowledge. And if the students change or if the knowledge change, how we can establish that relationship will change. So one of the real problems we face in a lot of contexts is ideas of best practice or what works that completely ignore the context, send people off in the wrong direction. Actually, we need educators to creatively reinterpret things based on their knowledge of their context and their students and to make them fit with their context. Just one other thing I'd say quickly is that the other thing is diversity is strength in this context. The more diverse people you have, the more different perceptions you have of a situation, the more likely you are to make a good decision. And in a world where suddenly diversity is presented as a problem, actually homogeneity is the problem. Diversity is where strength comes from.
Yeah.
So we have to draw on that diversity in our work.
Very well said. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Zoe. Gee, now we have Abdul Sami from University of Faisalabad. Abdul Sami.
Hi, thank you for a very nice presentation. My question is this, how can global best practices help Pakistan bridge curriculum inequality across public, private, and madrasa systems while respecting cultural values? And what role can international partners play in supporting inclusive curriculum reform and teacher development? Thank you.
I hope you understood the question. I would like, if you could sort of say it again, because there were a couple of components in your question which I missed.
Yeah. In Pakistan, we have public schools, private schools, madrasas, and they have different contents, different curriculums, and that causes a cohesion problem in Pakistan. And my question is, how can global best practices can help the bridge curriculum inequality across these systems? And what role can international partners play in supporting inclusive curriculum reforms and the development of teachers? This is my question. Thank you.
I hope you understood that there is a diversity in the schooling that we offer. And he just talked about 3. I think I can think of 10 different types of streams working in a schooling system. But nevertheless, how do you bridge those divides? And what are best practices that we can take from the West? I have another take on it, so don't ask me that question. But Paul and Zoe, if you could.
So we have to be, as I kind of said in my previous answer, we have to be really careful with best practices because they're always generated in particular contexts. They pretend that they're context free, they're not. Everything educational is contextual. So the way we can make best use of them, which was your question, is by reinterpreting them according to our context, by looking at them carefully in relation to what we're trying to achieve and saying what might work in our context, how might we usefully use this to do something we want to do. The other thing with those best practices is they kind of have outcomes built into them, but that might not be the outcomes we're interested in. You know, one of the real problems with higher education rankings is they've pushed this model of the university as if the aims of higher education should be the same in every country. Why would the aims of higher education in England be the same as the aims of higher education in Pakistan? So we have to reinterpret them, think about what works in our context. And similarly with international partners, they can offer us many things. They can offer us resources, they can offer us expertise, but they have to be part of a collective conversation focused on the particular context rather than lecturing other countries about the right way to do it.
I wish politicians were more academicians. Okay, Zoe, would you like to add something?
And I'm just going to add on the how do we bring international partners in, because I think it can be daunting, can't it, to sit there and think, oh gosh, I need to get an international voice, you know, and who do I want? And again, I would say comes back to your context and what it is you're looking for. So I used to hate that phrase when you go to a conference and your boss tells you to do some networking and you think, oh, I have to talk to people over sandwiches or, you know, whatever that sort of context is. And it's awful until you realize that actually what they mean is talk to the people who are interested in the same things as you. Talk to the people who are trying to do the same things as you. Don't bother talking to the people who aren't. You know, they're lovely, I'm sure, but you've got to be targeted in some of your approaches. So use networks that you can find, use social media. You know, if you're working on something and you perhaps do want a bit of an international voice, think about, well, have a look online. Is there somebody who purports to be an expert in this? And reach out to them if you can. But go out to them with a targeted question and a targeted, you know, idea, because that way you're more likely to have a much more meaningful conversation about whatever it is you're trying to get to, rather than trying to cast the net really wide and then you never really get anything of much use.
If I may add, in our context, I think in higher education, we are not in sync with our local community and local context. I think the first thing that we need to do in Pakistan is first to connect with our own context. And even that context differs from region to region. But that doesn't mean that there's no space for the global. So it's down, first understand where we are located, what is our context, what is our value system, what is the purposes that we want. I mean, offhand, I can quickly say that the human development that is proposed, and that is why I picked up Zoe whole person development, and it's coming to more into sort of, let me see, fashion now, if I can use a very lukewarm word for it. But East always focused on that. And then suddenly comes in the colonial rule and you are taken away only to the academia. That was not the literacy that we had and the education we had in our continent. Our education was a wholesome education of a wholesome individual. And we never thought that education, this is part of the education, this is not. What that has done is it has taken us away from our own identity and citizenship context. And we are struggling to match up to the West. And we can't do either. So I think somewhere, all of us, I think the talk that why we put up, and you talked so well about holistic student development, we have to revisit our roots. And you have helped us rethink the different parameters or the different contexts or the different things that need to be considered within that. And it's just not a simple thing. There's a lot of science to how you go about it. And we are very thankful to you for providing us that forum. And so we have to reconnect with our roots, with our traditions, with our cultural thinking. I'm not saying everything that happened is wrong and needs to be thrown out with the baby and the bathwater sort of a thing. There's a lot in there that's meaningful that we need to retain and also then relate to the global as the persons that we are in our own identity. And I think that's where we are missing out. I see there are some other hands, National Textile University, and Fatma, there are some questions also. Please, if you could state them. I'm sorry if you are overstaying, but this is the beauty. This is the time that is very important where people can sort of thrash out their questions and move with some things. I can see that people would want to leave. Another couple of questions, and then we'll sort of call it quits. I do see that Islamic International University, right? International Islamic, Malik Muhammad. Ali, you had your hand up for a very long time. Sorry for missing you. You're from Tanzania. Is that so? Oh,
Yes.
interesting. Okay. G.
Yeah, I am very much grateful to Paul and Zoe. They have contributed a lot for curriculum development and holistic human development. My question to Zoe has been posted like, if we have policy in place, and what is the term whereby we can renew our policies or we can update our policies? That's one question to Ms. Zoe. And also I had a question for Paul Ashwin, because when we were talking about curriculum implementation and curriculum development, so he had quoted a few examples from student, and it was just a thought which came while I was listening to his presentation, and I have put forward the question that how does a student contribute to the curriculum development, whereby the implication is after 6 years of following the curriculum itself?
They're a really great couple of questions, actually. So the first one around how do we get involved in policies and when are they due for renewal? Each policy may be different, and that may depend again on your own provider. So usually, and I am going to state with a big usually, not always the case, a policy will state on it when it was last updated. In some cases, depending on your structures, may say when it's due for renewal. Often you'll see that if there's like an external regulatory requirement around a particular policy. What I would say is it can be worth keeping an eye on, obviously, the policies that you've got, make sure you're aware of them. And think about what else is happening in your local, regional context, your national context, that might require a change in your policy. So often there are things that happen just nationally that mean that actually we have to revisit a policy. So that can be a good time to sort of try to get involved, because if they've got to update the policy anyway, that's a good time for us to get in there and say, hang on a minute, let's do a bit more on the pedagogy, on the curriculum, on the andragogy, to make sure that that's embedded in what we're thinking about. In terms of who's involved, sometimes those policies will state who's involved, but if you're not sure, have a chat amongst your team, with your line manager, whoever your sort of safe local support network is, to have that conversation, to find out a bit more. Often these things are considered by lots of teams of people, although there may only be one person named at the end. So sometimes it's about finding out who that team of people are and finding out, can you get onto that team? Is there a group who meet to address the considerations in that policy? Or is there a committee, for example, that you might want to go to? So it's about understanding, I suppose, that approach within your institution. It may look slightly different for each of us. But do have those sort of exploratory questions. I think it's a good idea to know your policies, know who or the structures that are involved, and then you can think about bringing forward some changes. From my experience, people are often quite happy to receive recommended changes because it means they haven't had to do the thinking. So although you may be thinking, oh gosh, I'm not sure I'm best placed for this, actually, as long as you approach it in a positive, professional manner, people are often quite sort of receptive to comments and suggestions.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in relation to your question about how can we involve students, given how long it takes them to develop their understanding, my view would be that this is where recognizing different kinds of expertise is so important. So students don't have expertise in the subject matter of the curriculum, but where they do have expertise is in their experiences of trying to come to terms with that subject matter. So actually, that's where these kind of diversity of perspectives in dialogue is so powerful, is that if we talk to our students about, well, how did you experience coming to study this module, and they talk about how it was, what aspects they found difficult, and then it depends on context. But if we can then have a collective conversation in which we explain why we designed things in the way they did, and they can talk about their experiences, and then we can collectively produce something new. So it's not that it's their expertise in the subject matter that enables them to contribute, it's their experiences of having to try to make sense of that, and us collectively coming together to think about how we might do things differently. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's that's as good as it gets.
Yes, thank you. We have another one from National Textile University. Zoe. Please unmute. G.
Yes. This question might be slightly outside the main topic, but as a student, I have noticed that many of us struggle with English due to a lack of foundational support. Do you think incorporating the native language more effectively in the curriculum could improve students' understanding and learning outcomes?
I'm sorry, could you state that again?
I'm saying that, do you think incorporating the native language more effectively in the curriculum could improve students' in understanding and learning outcomes?
There is a whole debate about language learning, and I think multilingual and bilingual approaches, but I leave Zoe and Paul because that does talk about leveling the playing field would mean getting across to students at the level that they are. And I think Zoe and Paul, if you could please respond to that briefly, if I may, because we're running over time.
Another fantastic question. And I think there's different ways to consider this. Often we can consider that actually, yes, using a language that students certainly feel much more comfortable with, or perhaps it's easier to engage, can be useful. My sort of counter argument, if I may, to that is we actually have a lot of students in our classes who have lots of different languages. So actually how we begin to determine which ones we would be able to deliver in a medium of and which ones we don't presents some possible challenges that maybe makes the inequalities worse, dare I say. There are though some really interesting things around that. And I know, for example, I'm based in England, but very close to us, the Welsh government actually have some stipulations around wanting students to retain some of that Welsh knowledge or have the opportunity to study in the Welsh medium. It's a very small proportion of the country who are able to speak it fluently. So they're trying to, much like we've talked about today, retain that heritage through that opportunity to learn in the actual language. So I think there's some really interesting ideas around this. It's something that could be explored, certainly, but I would come back to make sure that you're not doing it at the extent of leaving anybody out. That would be my sort of thought on that.
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, and I think, the key question is, why is the language that's the medium of instruction being used? Why is that decision being made? And if it's simply about prestige, then that's not a good reason. But if it's related to the educational outcomes, then that might be a reason. But that doesn't mean, okay, well, it definitely has to be, say, in English, because you might think about, well, how do we take these students whose current academic English isn't in a position to enable them to access their course and support them to access it? So clearly, the closer we get to students' current experiences when they enter, the more educationally successful it will be. But we also need to think about the educational intentions and what we're trying to do with the course, and really question why we're doing particular kinds of things.
Yes, and if I may add, no matter how much I don't know how to put this, is to offer a language that is equally understood by everybody is not possible. I will be saying a sentence and no matter, even if it's understandable and you understand it, everybody will take away something else from that one small single sentence. Like you said, Paul, it's your experiences and what hits you as the most important component in there. So leveling the playing field will always be a struggle. It will be a moving target because there were so many variables that we will have to juggle. And all I can say is we should do our best. There's not one answer that I would say will work. One last question. Are there any questions in the chat, Fatma, that we might have overlooked?
Yes, there are many actually.
Oh my.
We have a question for Paul. How do educational leaders observe the sociological effects of knowledge on the human brain, considering that knowledge is a tangible entity while its implications are emotional?
Just a small question then. So I would say through assessment. Yeah, that's the function of assessment, is to give students the space to demonstrate how they come into relationship to knowledge and what the impact is. If your assessment doesn't do that, then it's the wrong assessment.
Yeah. But like Zoe said, the holistic student development, there's a lot about the emotional well-being as well. So that component has to come into play at some point. The next question. Fatima?
Yes. What role can curriculum play in providing practical knowledge engagement for students to align with current market trends?
And who was the question by? Please state the name.
Directed towards Paul.
No, but who stated the question?
I don't have the name right now, but I'll find it.
Please try to note who is asking the question. Yes. G. Paul.
Yeah, so my position on this is that it depends on the subject that students are studying. So as I mentioned, we tracked students for 7 years studying chemistry and chemical engineering. And when we asked them after 7 years, when they're in jobs, what was the most useful thing they got from their degrees, it was the way of engaging with the world that came from this collective body of knowledge. And I think, there's something about the structure of knowledge that makes it transferable across situations. So things that look like practical knowledge that might be immediately helpful actually have a very short shelf life and apply to very few contexts. So more students get into the structure of knowledge and use that as a way of engaging the world, the more relevant that will be to their employment opportunities.
Yeah. Yes.
Zoe, we have a question for you. How can institutions ensure that their support systems are not just accessible, but also truly inclusive and effective for marginalized or underrepresented student populations?
So I would say this is where you really want to engage your students in helping you to understand what that experience is like for them. So, and often students are quite happy, if you've asked them, how did you find that experience? They've often got plenty to say about that and will happily share that with you, especially if you explain to them that actually we're asking you because we need to know what it's like from your perspective. We may have designed a system where we think this is a really open door, but actually there's a whole load of steps and barriers that before you've even got there, and we can't necessarily see that. So I would say really engage your students. You may do that at the local level in your module by asking a question. You may have other structures that you might do that through, depending on the sort of the context of the question or what it is you're trying to do. But I say work with your students. In some contexts, you may find that there are certain requirements for accessibility measures. You could use those as sort of checklists if you wanted to. But I really think speaking to the end user, if you like, is a really useful way forward there.
G. Fatima?
A question for Paul. How do we create responsive curriculums when the main bodies responsible for the curriculum are rigid?
Yes. So exactly. And so all we can do there is to work out what leeway we have to interpret. Often these things are in a textual form, and things that we think are completely closed, if we think about them creatively, actually they don't state the things we think they state. So the way to do it is to look very carefully at the text of the curriculum, work out what you want to do, and think about, is there a way of describing what you want to do that fits with the text of the curriculum? Often people, my colleague has the term ghost policy. often people think things are a policy and they're not. And when you actually look, it doesn't say quite what people think. So really interrogate the curriculum and work out where the space is for you to do the things that you think are educationally important.
Excellent. Yeah, that's true. Do that and then do more. Do what the curriculum says. And I was always used to say in my class, I can do some more that I want to do. Gee, another question?
Last question for both Zoe and Paul. How can we facilitate scientific knowledge irrespective of native language barriers by leveraging the inclusive framework?
Okay.
Again, I think this comes back to that sort of discussion we've had on language already around, obviously you'll have an agreed medium of delivery, a language of delivery. So obviously using that as your primary route. But again, and I think this may apply to scientific knowledge, it could apply to dance, it could apply to sculpture, it may apply to a whole different things. That thinking about that mention that I gave of universal design for learning, we all learn in different ways. So some people may appreciate something being represented visually. Some people may prefer that to read a lengthy document about it. Others may prefer a few bullet points. So sometimes actually the method of communication is about finding different ways to make the same point, or indeed, again, working with your students to find out what works well for them. What are they doing with that information that you've presented? Are they then interpreting it in their own way? So lots of different ideas, I think, in terms of that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So my original research was on peer learning and using students to support each other. And that question, peer learning is a key way that you can support a variety of language contexts. Think about the resource you have in your students and how you can bring them together across different years in order to support each other.
I think in our context, in our culture, there is that authoritarian and that model also that exists, which should not be there. And I have noticed we do not realize that our students are an immense body of resource, and they're remarkable. I am amazed always. I don't teach students anymore. It's been 20 years. But whenever I come across students, they are like they have points to offer which you never thought about, and that their prism of looking and their perspectives are so real that they make you question why you were thinking so in the first way. So I think that's a resource. And like Paul, you said, for the curriculum, the voice, the largest stakeholder is the voice of the student. And at our campus, we also our new teachers, when we sort of induct them, one of the basic things we teach them is that before you even start your class, learn to understand your student. Ask them, know how they want to be taught, how they learn best, what are their pluses, what are some of the things they want to sort of struggle with, where they need help. And we have a whole sort of a form where we ask, why don't you ask them these questions? And in a class of 30, Paul and Zoe, that's a tough ask for one course. But that's what we expect our faculty to sort of be in touch with, the student, and what they want out of the course, not what you want to give, sort of an approach. Thank you both. I know you, in your part of the world, you need to take away a time and put away the time year ahead, I think, of the event. And I am extremely thankful to you for offering your time so graciously, so freely, so voluntarily. And this is the sort of debate and discussion and sharing that brings us together and makes us realize that at the end we are not so different at all. We are struggling with the same problems in our parts of the world. Immense thanks to all of you for being here with us. There's still, I think, 211 participants, and each one of you is precious. Your being here is precious for us, and thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Gee, you didn't say anything, Melanie. You didn't ask any questions, and I was wondering if there would be any questions from you. No. Are you enjoying these sessions, waking up at 4 a.m.? Are they worth your while? Okay, I hope so.